Amendment number 2 here proposes in page 4, line 19, after practitioner, to insert the following words: other than a general practitioner who has notified the Minister that the practitioner does not wish the premises at which he or she provides healthcare services to be deemed for the purpose of this Act to be a relevant healthcare premises. Entering that in page 4, line 19, is to provide that for the definition of relevant healthcare provider, and that where that includes a general practitioner, that it would therefore exclude any general practitioner who has notified the Minister in the terms that I have just outlined. And the effect of that would be to provide that since, for example, a GP who has a conscientious objection to the provision of the services in question doesn't want to be in any way, shape or form used in the context of any threat by the Gardaí of prosecution or any attempt to move people on, people who are engaging in legitimate and respectful freedom of expression, that you wouldn't have the anomalous situation that a general practitioner who agrees 100% with the concerns being expressed would find themselves at risk of being used for the purposes of the prosecution of a law that they regard to be unjust in the first place. You could describe it as the not in my name amendment. I think it's a very straightforward issue. It's quite clear that this legislation is unprecedented. It interferes with normal freedom of expression in a very surprising and unexpected way. It puts at risk of public harassment by the Gardaí or otherwise, or the forces of law and order, people who see themselves as solid and responsible citizens objecting to something that they regard as a breach of fundamental, authentic human rights. I think it's all the more appropriate that those who are practicing medicine in good faith and in good conscience, and honouring, as many don't, as many do not, honouring the Hippocratic Oath, honouring the time-honoured principle of doing no harm and doing as much good as possible, but first doing no harm, prima non nocere, that those people can be separated out from any possible implication in the workings of this law. So that's the proposal. I had set out at committee stage that I would be tabling these amendments again. Most of them, except for the first, I withdrew precisely so as to give the Department of Health and the Minister time to consider what are, in my view, and I think in the view of many others, reasonable proposals that seek to mitigate the worst effects of, as I said, this strange and unprecedented new law, a law which I believe has, is of doubtful constitutionality, I have to say, by way of aside. I've said that before. But certainly, if the Minister wants to propose this law, then he should only do so where he seeks to reassure people that he is seeking to limit its scope and not to embarrass or compromise any people who have objections in good faith to the procedures that are at the heart of this legislation. Thank you.
Anish on ARA.
And what appears to be proposed here is an opt-out for service providers, or an opt-out option rather. From the outset, there's been a core policy principle that the legislation would not forcibly highlight or identify the specific service sites where termination of pregnancies are being provided, and would allow them to continue in relative anonymity where preferred. To accept this amendment would risk undermining that principle, and therefore I won't be accepting it. It should also be remembered, obviously, in the context that the psychological impact of these protests extends beyond those availing of termination services to stillbirth, pregnancy loss and neonatal death as well.
Yes, well, now for the first time I have to say I'm disappointed with the Minister's response, but I think the problem is that the Minister doesn't address the core of the purpose of the proposed amendment. His latter point, that those who might be distressed by any reasonable witness, is of course this is the premise of the whole bill, that this bill seeks to limit freedom of expression on the grounds that certain other people may profess to be offended or hurt or wounded by it, when it is entirely possible to make clear, and indeed this has been said on many occasions by the Garda authorities. I'll return to that, no doubt, in the course of our discussion about these subsequent amendments, that where any wrongdoing would arise in the context of these protests, and we're living in an era of protest, it has to be said, and we're living in an era where there's a lot of debate about the extent to which the Gardaí and the way in which the Gardaí go about prosecuting their tasks, and the support that they deserve, and the necessary restraint that they will also choose to show, precisely because they respect people's right to protest. Yet the notion of people's right to protest or even to witness respectfully is completely absent from the spirit underlying this legislation. So the Minister's additional point there doesn't address at all the purpose of this amendment. The suggestion as well that somehow the whole policy objective is to prevent the identification of any person who is in the position of providing the services at issue. Again, it's nonsensical for the Minister to claim that as a justification for failing to provide for somebody who specifically wants to opt in and notify the Minister that they don't want in any way to be involved or used as an excuse for the curtailment of reasonable protest or witnessing. So the idea that, you know, because we don't want any premises kind of mentioned in the process, but what if the premises itself wants to be mentioned, or it wants at least to be, to, as I say, break out from its own anonymity, precisely because it doesn't want a situation where some officious bystander approaches the Gardaí, who are busy enough, let it be said, trying to deal with many problems in our country at the moment, and some officious bystander approaches the Gardaí and wants to create hassle or to harass using the law, let's say 2 or 3 respectable citizens who nonetheless have a deep, conscientious concern about the breach of human rights going on at the heart of all of this. And they draw the Gardaí's attention to the fact that there is a general practitioner's a general practice within 80 metres of where this protest is going on. And despite the fact that the general practice in question might be among the great majority who are not opting into the provision of this service, and because they might fully agree that what's going on here that's being protested against is not good medicine, should not happen, is damaging doctor-patient relationships, is undermining authentic health care in the country. And because they would, you know, and the Minister doesn't even see fit to allow that such a general practitioner can say, not in my name, and put it clearly on the record, we are not to be used or invoked or instrumentalised in the prosecution of this new law, which we regard as unjust. I think this goes to the heart of the complete failure of the Minister, of the Government, of the Department of Health, to fail to respect that there is a legitimate difference of opinion going on in this country around these controversial services. A difference of opinion between people who regard them as healthcare, quote unquote, and people who regard these termination of pregnancy services as the antithesis of good healthcare. And the idea that the Minister and the Department and the Government will not even tolerate that somebody in medicine who completely disagrees, who wants to completely dissociate, who doesn't want in any way to be used in the prosecution of this legislation, that they may not be enabled, shows the intolerance and the cancel culture that is at the heart of this government's approach to all of these issues around termination of pregnancy services. Because, as I have said before, the aim is not really to protect anybody here. Because if it was, we would have heard from the Gardaí who would have said there is disturbance of the peace going on, there is harassment going on, we have been prosecuting it. Not only have the Gardaí said that there is nothing happening that requires new laws, but they haven't had anything to enforce, even in relation to the laws that exist. And that shows the intolerance of this government, that it is basically not out to protect anybody at all here. They're not out to protect people availing of a termination of pregnancy services. They are out to cancel and to eliminate legitimate opposition and dissent to what is going on. And that is what has the government and this government and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and the Green Party and, let it be said, Sinn Féin and the parties on the left. That is what has all of those parties in the dock in the eyes of an increasing number of citizens of this country. And we saw it in the result of the referendum. You want to control what people think and what people say in a matter that is not befitting of a democracy, in a matter that is entirely unconstitutional, and your trick, and the big woke trick, is always to dress it up bogusly and dishonestly as some form of compassion. Except in this case, you cannot even produce evidence that anybody has been wronged, because we all know the reality is that there are actually very few protests. There's very little witnessing going on. That's because of the nature of this service. There aren't designated clinics in the country providing this service. So people who access healthcare in whatever setting do so quite anonymously as regards the healthcare that they're accessing. And even when what they're accessing is not bona fide healthcare, but a service that cannot be properly designated as healthcare because it ends an innocent human life, that is not something that the person who might be witnessing can, outside or engaging in any kind of lawful protest, that's not something they can know. And that's perfectly desirable that they should not know it, because the whole aim of the witnessing that's going on is never to target any person. It is to target an unjust service. It is to further the conversation in our society about the injustice of this procedure. And therefore, what we see here, when the only evidence that the Minister was able to draw on wasn't evidence at all. It was a letter from the HSE, and it was the claims of an advocacy group who were not even supported by the local hospital in the place where they were advocating. So we have these claims that people are being harassed, that people are being unjustly treated, but actually no evidence of it whatsoever. Because if there was evidence of it, we would know about it from the Gardaí. Yeah, oh, by all means, I'm happy to give way.
Thanks, Chair. Just on a point of information,
I'll let him know.
as with many things the Senator has said, what he has just said is entirely false. The evidence that was presented from the HSE. They were not referencing civil society groups. It was a considered formal submission to the Oireachtas by the HSE, and it referenced widespread feedback from their own employees, doctors and nurses across the country. The record will show that when this was presented, the Senator went on to describe not just the government as corrupt, but the HSC as a corrupt institution, and decried our doctors and nurses as liars. So I just want to make sure that it's very clear that there is evidence, and the great irony being, of course, we're not allowed to say lie, whatever the appropriate word is, Chair, that is emanating so far today comes in fact from Senator Mullen, and that's all on the record documented. Gurmagat.
I thank the Minister for his intervention, but of course he is the one who is misleading not just this House, but the public, as he has done so all along. As I have pointed out, the Minister's approach to all of this, when truth and facts are presenting them, is reminiscent of the Borg in Star Trek. I get the glazed eye, the refusal to point to specific information. The computer says no. I am on board with abortion advocates. I am in their pocket. I will do their bidding. However, when the facts are put to the Minister, when he's incompetent, and indeed the corruption of this particular task by the Minister and his cohort in the Department of Health is exposed.
Be careful in your
yes.
language.
Well, I have said on the record that there is something corrupt about the government's
like,
treatment of this issue.
I
have to say that in all honesty.
I ask you to be careful on your language in
yeah.
terms of members,
and I have,
members but also ministers who come to this House.
Yeah. Well, I've always said, and I will say it again, I have nothing personal against the Minister at all. But I have nothing but contempt, I'm sorry to say, for the way he does his job specifically on this issue. Because he is not in the service of truth, he is not in the service of good health care. He has acted in a way that is completely disregards, and I told you before that, privately say, oh, I'll meet anybody. His only approach ever on this issue has been to meet with advocacy groups on abortion, and he has refused to meet pro-life advocacy groups or experts. So that shows, at the minimum, incompetence, certainly an element of arrogance in the department's approach to this issue, a lack of respect for democracy, a lack of respect for the principles of inclusivity and a consultative approach, and all the things you would expect for normal business. But normal business doesn't apply when it comes to abortion advocacy, because this government, this department, this minister are in the hands of a very corrupt and tendentious agenda. And if you needed proof of it, it was the minister's promise to have a public consultation before the appointment of an independent person to conduct a review, a 3-year review of the abortion legislation. And we got a denial and a rejection and a reneging on that promise because you had a closed appointment. And secondly, the person who was appointed wasn't even independent and had skin in the game in terms of abortion advocacy. So that shows you the level of honesty of this government when it comes to dealing with this issue. And it is perfectly possible for me to say I have nothing personal against Stephen Donnelly personally. But as I said, the way he has handled this issue has been a disaster. It has cost thousands of lives. We now have 10,000 abortions happening a year. That is a tragedy. It can only be described in terms of its being a Holocaust. We have seen nothing like it in our country since the famine. And he and previous Minister for Health are responsible for that. So it's a very, very grave situation. But when he says, that I lie by suggesting he has produced no evidence, he has produced no evidence. Minister, a submission from the HSE is not evidence. You could give me evidence that you have a submission from the HSE. You have evidence of that. But a submission from the HSE that makes claims and that claims to have concerned doctors and nurses, and you won't show any of it to us? This wouldn't happen in any other area of medicine. It wouldn't happen in any other department. But this government's approach is to obfuscate and, if necessary, lie. And we saw this in the run-up to the heavily defeated referendum proposals as well. There was a public consultation carried out, and despite repeated requests, we never got the results of the public consultation until after the referendums had taken place. And then those public consultations showed that nobody really wanted the referendums anyway, except a few NGOs. But it didn't suit the government for that information to be known, so they hid it. This is the way you go on. You obfuscate, you deny, you pretend that a HSE submission cooked up at your request from the HSE for which you have ultimate responsibility is somehow constitute evidence. You haven't produced evidence. You haven't quoted a single thing. You haven't quoted anybody except an advocacy group that is in itself discredited and which is a highly tendentious approach and is in denial about all sorts of realities in relation to termination of pregnancy services. So you can say Borg-like as much as you want that you are telling the truth and I'm lying, but your inability to produce a shred of evidence when invited repeatedly to do so lays bare the moral and political bankruptcy of your position, Minister. You know, and you can just smile glibly through it all and then turn every now and again when you don't like what I'm saying to the chair to say, you know, can he really say this? It has to be said, you know, because your handling of your brief in this area is an absolute disgrace and it's a tragedy. And you will not be viewed well in history. You have a job for a few years as a TD and you're a minister and it's great and I congratulate you and I wish you well in all your duties. But when I see you doing evil things in your brief, and this is an evil thing because it costs lives, it endangers people's safety, and it endangers free speech, and it endangers freedom of expression. It is the antithesis of democratic practice. I have to call you out on that. I could be your best friend meeting you in a pub tonight. I would have to call you out on this. You have to be called out on it because you are acting wrongly and in a way that is quite unprecedented. So, though you may seek to claim that you have produced evidence and that it's a lie for me to say otherwise, no, you are the one that is misleading the world in claiming that you have some kind of evidence. You have a document from the HSE. You haven't quoted a single medical practitioner here today. But what I did quote to you at committee stage and what I quote to you again now is that the Garda Commissioner made it clear some years ago now that there was no need for extra law, if I recall correctly, that the law was there in the statute books to deal with anything that would need to be dealt with if people were behaving inappropriately in the context of protest. We have no evidence of the Gardaí even moving people on, much less instigating a prosecution. Okay? We have no evidence, therefore, for those responsible for trying to keep the peace in our society and to protect the vulnerable and to secure good citizenship, no evidence that they have any problem with the absence of this legislation. And then you try and claim that this is about preventing people from being hurt and upset, and you have nobody that you can quote other than a pro-abortion advocacy group. And you try then to claim that because you have a document from the HSE that says this is needed. So we know what goes on in government. We know the way you order up reports and advice to suit your agenda. That's not evidence. That's not evidence of a kind that any reasonable voting citizen has the right to expect. So please, Minister, don't insult our intelligence by suggesting you have evidence when you haven't. And don't disrespect people by misleading them to the extent that you are seeking to mislead them today.
Bring back in the Minister. Could I welcome Richard?